So next Sunday is February the 2nd, which happens to be Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day is the day when we try to predict when the monotony of winter will actually come to an end, and when the next season of spring will cycle in. Using some key words here, cycle in. The way we treat Groundhog Day kind of reminds me of something that Berna's grandmother, or Nanny, used to say. And it was this: as a rule, man's a fool. When it's hot, he wants it cool. When it's cool, he wants it hot. Always wanting what it's not. And that's the way we feel sometimes, particularly when we get the winter starts to drag on, and so we look forward to Groundhog Day. In 1993, there was Groundhog Day became the setting of a comedy film that bears its name. How many of you saw the film? Okay. It stars Bill Murray as Phil Connors, who's a TV weatherman, who, during an assignment to cover the annual Groundhog Day events in Puxatawny, what happened was he got caught in a continuum, a time loop, and he was reliving Groundhog Day every single day. Now, there's been a lot of questions and queries as to how long it was. The movie directors said the only thing they figure is it's got to be at least 40 years. The more estimate by some people who like to do math and figure stuff out, they think it's more like 10,000 years. The whole point is he's caught in this continual looping, this cycle of Groundhog Day. Every day wakes up, it's Groundhog Day. And one of the things that happens is as he's waking up for the umpteenth time, he realizes that there are actually no consequences for his actions. So he does a lot of ridiculous and treacherous things. He spends the first several loops indulging in wild living and going after everything that the world would have for him to get into it. And then after spending several loops trying and failing to court Rita, he begins to get desperate and depressed, and he's seeking for a solution to end the loop. At this point, he realizes that he can't beat it. It's just going to keep going, day after day after day the same. So he realizes that he can use this repetition as an opportunity for self-improvement. While he learns the piano, he learns to French poetry, he learns how to ice sculpt, and he also knows when people are going to fall into trouble, and so he's there to help people out in the nick of time. His only regret during all of this time is that he cannot save the life of the homeless man from certain death. So Groundhog Day is a lot like the book of Ecclesiastes. And it begs the question, what is the meaning of life? We wake up and it's today. And every day I wake up, it's today. Tomorrow when I wake up, it will be today. It's always today. And life is a series of cycling todays and monotonous routines. Last Sunday we gathered for church, as we did the week before, and the week before that. And next Sunday, Lord willing, we're going to be gathering again, and the week after that. And so there's this cycle that we go through, and the content may be different every Sunday, but the order of the service is pretty much the same week after week. We can tend to get bored with that. But that's the way life is. And it's very easy to feel like life is nothing but a time loop that generation after generation is caught up in. When King Cyrus, the Persian king, conquered the Babylonians, he gave permission for the Jewish people to return to their land. And not many of them returned at first. It took 3, possibly 4 different times of persuasion to get the bulk of the people to return. Historians still tell us that a great number of Jews never left. They stayed in the land of Babylon. But there were a few that did return to the land, who were really old people. They had seen the old Temple of Solomon. They knew the glory days of Jerusalem. But most of the people only knew the life in Babylon. Just like the wilderness generation that did not enter into the promised land after the Exodus, this generation of slaves in Babylon never got to return to the land. And so the Jews, they needed a reason and a purpose for their existence. And that's where Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, and the author of Ecclesiastes come in. They reminded the people of God that God had made a covenant with them, and they need to live by faith and walk in holiness. I just wondered if you were reading up there or not. They needed to live by faith and walk in holiness. And they needed to have a purpose. And so they told them, listen, God has made it so that you are the generation that needs to restore the city, rebuild the temple, and get everything ready for God's king who will come and deliver them. They had a purpose again. But now what they needed was to find meaning in that purpose. They needed meaning in order to persevere and to remain faithful. Now let me remind you of the setting of the book of Ecclesiastes. So the people of God have been gathered together in a room to hear the preacher. They've come to listen to the preacher. The meeting starts out with the moderator who gets up, and he had just finished introducing the topic under discussion. So given the fact, he says that life is cyclical and it's repetitive and filled with monotonous routines where nothing new ever really happens, where the world seems to be caught in a time loop that's moving forward one day after at a time. The question is asked, what does man gain by the toil? All the work that he does in his lifetime, how does it benefit man? How does the world benefit from this? And in short, what is the meaning of life? So this is the setting, this is the question that has been put forward to the preacher. And he's been invited to come and speak to the people and answer the question, what is the meaning of life? So in chapter 1, beginning at verse 12, the preacher gets up to speak. And he's going to raise a number of points. Today we're going to only look at his first point. But he's going to raise a number of points in his attempt to systematically discover the meaning of life. And the thing is that as we go, particularly with the first point, we're thinking, oh, there is no hope at all. It's kind of a fatalism and pessimism that he seems to be building, which is the worldview of the pagan world that all of these Jews have been brought up in. But he's building on each of these points, so you need to bear with us as we go through the book, because he will come to a meaningful conclusion about the meaning of life. So here in verse 12, he begins by introducing himself. He says, I'm the preacher, and I have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. King over Israel in Jerusalem. Now that's very similar to how the author had portrayed the announcement in chapter 1, verse 1, where he is inviting all the people, come and hear the preacher, the king of Jerusalem. But he adds this phrase, the king over Israel, in Jerusalem. Now, Israel here refers to the combined nations. Okay? It's not divided at this point. So Solomon is the only king that ever, and David, of course, were the only kings of the united nation. It wasn't until Solomon's son, Rehoboam, that the nation was divided between Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And so the author is really making it clear that we understand that the preacher is a Solomon-type person. Now, the verb here in this text, where it says, has been king, is actually a completed action in the past. So it's speaking from a point sometime subsequent to Solomon's reign as king. And it further indicates to us that what the author is doing is he is bringing a person who is a personification of King Solomon, but not King Solomon himself. And it's important that we realize that, because as king, he brings authority to what he says. And because he's King Solomon, he brings wisdom to what he says, and knowledge and wealth to be able to do everything that he says. So that's important. But it's not Solomon. It's only a made-up character by the author who is a Solomon-like person. So this is the way I describe it. Now what he does here is he repeats what he said, what was said back in chapter 1, verse 2, that life is vanity. So what does vanity mean again? Well, it means that life is a riddle, that it's like a puzzle. You can't really figure it out. And you can do all kinds of things in living this life, but it really is vain. It doesn't accomplish anything. Or at least it doesn't seem to accomplish anything. It seems to be meaningless. Now we can find a lot of meaning in the parts of life, but life itself really has no meaning to it. So in verses 13 to 18, he gives us a summary. It's interesting how the writers back then would bring the conclusion point at the beginning and then give you the points leading up to it. Now when I preach a sermon, I don't want you to know the end until I get there. But they give the ending. I mean, talk about spoiler alerts, right? He gives the ending at the beginning, and then he explains how he got to that conclusion. And so verses 13 to 18 are the conclusion of his findings here. And what he says is that he applied all of his wisdom, all of his knowledge, all of his wealth. He did everything that he could to find out the meaning of life. He did everything and saw everything that there is to do under the sun, that is in life. And he concludes that, look at it there, it says, he concludes that life is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Well, that's kind of fatalistic, isn't it? Life is an unhappy business that God's given to us to be busy with. In other words, what he's saying is that meaning in life eludes him to the point that it makes him sad that he can't figure it out. And that's really his point. It's not so much that living in this life is just unhappy, but it's that you cannot figure out what the meaning is. So he even reminds them that he, of course, was the wisest person in Jerusalem. And as the wisest person, he still can't figure it out. And if he can't figure it out, then no one can figure it out. So he says in verse 18 that his search has brought him a lot of vexation. What does the word vexation mean? It means grief. Okay? It means it caused him a lot of headache trying to figure this out, because in the end of it, he couldn't figure out. And of course, that grief turned to sadness. And he's going to talk about these two words later on, and we'll come to that. So the question that the moderator asked in chapter 1, verse 2 was, does man gain by all the toil? Is there gain for man in living life in this world? Is there gain for the world, for others in this world? And the preacher's answer is, yes, I think there is. Now some people will beg to differ with me on that, but let me prove what he means. He begins his quest in chapter 2, verse 1, to prove that man does gain from the toil of life. Okay? His premise is that man gains joy and pleasure from life. Life gives us joy and it gives us pleasure, and that must give us meaning. This is where his thinking is going. Now, a lot of people think that he's trying to find joy and happiness and therefore meaning by giving into the pleasures of life, the negative things like drinking and sex and orgies and those kinds of things. But that's really not what he's talking about here at all. He's not being Pinocchio on Pleasure Island. He is talking about finding pleasure in the things that his wealth and knowledge help him to get, the luxuries of life. I mean, let's look at him. He describes them there in verses 4 to 8. So look at your text, verse 8. He says, I made great things. I made great things. I built houses. I planted vineyards. Verse 5. I had gardens. I had parks. I planted fruit trees. Verse 6. I even made pools to water all of the plants. I bought slaves. Verse 7. And I had all kinds of herds and flocks. And verse 8, I in fact had accumulated a lot of silver and a lot of gold. I got very wealthy through all of my work, through all of my toil. And I even got some singers, both male singers and female singers. I'm not really sure why he put it that way. That must be some kind of a cultural thing. Whether it's singers were really females and he says, I got males as well as females, or whether he's saying that really they're just males. I got males and I even got females. I have no idea. The point is that he was able to afford entertainment and private entertainment. He would be able to pay for it. And he could go to all of the shows that were out there. He could go to the movies, and he could go to the plays and to the concerts and occupy his time with all kinds of entertainment. All of these things that he listed here are things that bring joy and happiness to people. Look at verse 10. Here's what he says about this. Verse 10. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. For my heart found what? My heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all my toil. See that? He says, I worked really hard, and because I worked really hard and applied wisdom and knowledge to the things that I worked at, I was able to accumulate wealth, and that afforded me the ability to be able to enjoy all the things that life has. So I have a big house. I have a really good car that's paid off. I have the latest in all of the gadgets. All of the Wi-Fi gadgets, so I can clap and my lights turn on. All these things that we see as luxuries, he was able to have. And his conclusion was, my heart found pleasure in all of them. I was happy. I was happy. He pursued happiness, and he found happiness in his success and in all of the luxuries that money could afford. You see, it's not negative stuff, it's positive stuff. At least that's what he thought. Because verse 11, he begins to reflect. So he's feeling pretty smug in a way. He says, see, yeah, there is gain for man. Happiness. And then he starts thinking, wait a minute. Happiness is not meaning. And so in verse 11, he begins to reflect on this happiness. And as he reflects on the things that he has accumulated and that bring him pleasure in life, he begins to realize that it took a lot of time and work to get to this place where he can say, now I'm happy. But then he looks at his life and he says, wait a minute. I don't have a physical ability to enjoy it because I'm old. And because I'm old, I don't have the time to enjoy it. So now he begins to realize that his life is almost over. And his joy is short-lived. So even though he got joy, now he's lost his joy because he can't enjoy the joy. As long as he had goals that he was working towards, he was happy, but as soon as he accomplished his goals, he realized that what life he had left was too short to enjoy it. The one great shadow that has been encroaching all the way through this section is that death robs us of the time to enjoy the pleasures of life and involuntarily removes the pleasure and the joy that we thought we had. The greatest problem for the preacher is not that he gained joy and happiness, but that life is too short to find meaning in that joy and happiness. So in verses 12 to 11, he starts thinking now about the end of life. Is there meaning to life? There certainly is. We can get happiness. We can find it. But is that all there is? So in verse 12, he talks about his heirs. He says, even my heir, by the time they get to the age where I've passed on and they can inherit all the things that I've accumulated, he says, guess what? They're old too. Time is beginning to run out for them. Now, he does recognize that there is more gain in working hard and wisely, which is a good thing for us to recognize. But whether we live wisely or foolishly, his conclusion is the same. We all die. We're all going to die. It doesn't matter how we live our lives, we're all going to die. Now, he's not saying live it any way you want. He's saying it is better to be wise in the way you live your life. But the reality is that we're all going to die. Every single one of us. And this is causing him great problems because it's taking away his joy and finding meaning in life. He says that the wise and the fool, that they may live differently, but in time they will all be indistinguishable. Look at verse 15. Verse 15 actually records his shock when he realized that death is the great equalizer. Death is the great equalizer. Look at the verse. What happens to the fool will also happen to me. You feel his frustration. He goes on to say, what is the point in working hard when it doesn't really accomplish anything? It doesn't really give us any meaning to life anyways. He realizes that we all die and then we're forgotten. And even the good things that we do eventually will be forgotten as well. I was remarking the other day to Berna, we were talking about her mom passed away 2 years ago, and she was saying that she was missing her more this year than she did last year. And my dad has been gone for much longer, and I was telling her, you know, it's got to the place where I can barely remember what my dad looks like. And there used to be things that would always spark my memory. So if I heard of a song or a noise or a smell even, all of a sudden I'd get an image of my dad, but it doesn't happen anymore. What's the point, he says. And of course, he realizes that once the inheritance does go to the heirs, he says, what's going to happen to all of those things? If what I've done in life doesn't prolong joy and purpose and give meaning to anybody, then what's the sense? So he's accumulated luxuries that have brought him joy and happiness, but along comes this thought of death, and it robs him of all of his joy, because it destroys any chance of finding any meaning. What a turnaround this is. Remember, look back at verse 10 again. Verse 10 says, my heart found pleasure in all of my toil. He was really happy. I pursued happiness. I found happiness in my success and in the luxuries that are in life. Man, my heart is really happy. But now look at verse 18. He says, I hated all my toil. What a turnaround. We live and work and accumulate and retire only to find out that we're too old to enjoy it. We live life in vain, thinking that it's going to make us happy, and that happiness and accomplishment is going to give us meaning to life. And when we get there, we realize it doesn't do any of that. You know, for 32 years, I was a financial planner. I was a certified financial planner, if I may boast. Okay? And I would ask people who would come to meet with me, I would say, what do you want to do when you retire? They would say, well, I would like to travel, a number of things. And I said, have you ever traveled before? Well, no. What makes you think you're going to travel when you retire? And usually that's what it is. They have these grandeur ideas, but they've never done them before, and the chances are they'll never do them when they retire. But nevertheless, everybody has some idea of what they want to do and how great and grand it's going to be. And we talk about the glory years or the golden years of retirement. Have you heard that phrase before, the golden years? Okay. Well, then my next question to them was always this. How long do you think you'll be able to do that? You see, retirement has two stages to it. The golden years, which is approximately 10 to 15 years max. And then the care years. The care years. Somebody's got to take care of you. We don't think of that. That was one of my pet peeves as a financial planner, is that none of my competitors ever told people that. They only planned for the golden years. And they planned for it as if it would last forever. Anyways, you see, the reality is the golden years of retirement don't last. And our time of living and enjoying and being happy with all the things that we have accumulated is very short. And people don't want to think about that. They would much rather think that they would live forever. But the reality is, death is waiting at everybody's door. So here's the thing. The preacher has thought that there was meaning and there was purpose and hope to be found in this world. And if we would just apply wisdom and knowledge and work really hard, you can have all of the things that bring you this joy and happiness. But what he found with success is incomplete joy. Incomplete joy. Because here's what happens. The more you have, the more you want. And when you try to build your life on success and on the things you own, it becomes an idol in your life. And an idol is anything that replaces God in being your ultimate, that defines who you are and what is your purpose. And it's incomplete joy. And idols, you see, they feed desires. And they leave you wanting more, but there's nothing to satisfy. But death stops us in our tracks. Even Phil Connors thought that if I just kill myself, it'll end this loop of Groundhog Day. But it never did. He could commit suicide, he could step in front of a train, a car, or anything, and die that day. But he woke up every morning. Groundhog Day all over again. That part is not real. The way we do interrupt the monotony of the cycles of life is death. And that's why a lot of people get to a place of despair. And despair is the place where you no longer have an ultimate. But life has come to the place where you say, there is absolutely no meaning. It is all vanity. And all the hard work and the stuff that we do has no meaning whatsoever and no purpose. And that despair leads to death. But that's not the way God meant it to be. It's not the way He meant it to be. So, there is no contentment. There is no rest. Now, He's not advocating despair, okay? But He's just creating the scenarios of the reality, taking us through His thought process. All right, yes, there is meaning in life. It comes by the luxuries of life, by hard work, and we find that we pursue happiness, and we can find happiness. But when he got to finding happiness, he realized it's short-lived. And that caused him problems, and it disturbed him. And then he realized that the big interrupter of life and of enjoying life is death itself. And so he's got a problem here with death. And he realizes that there is no real contentment in life. There is no rest. Look at verse 22 and 23. Verse 22. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? What has he got after all of this? He thought he had happiness. Verse 23. For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. His heart does not rest. That's where his happiness was. After I accumulated all this stuff, I realized my heart is filled with joy. Then death came along, or the thought of death. And he realizes, my heart can't rest. Did you notice how the things that brought him to joy, that brought the preacher joy in verses 4 to 6, how they actually remind us of God's creation in the Garden of Eden? Did you notice that? Here, look at those things. He planted vineyards. He had gardens, fruit trees. He had ponds to water the trees. Sounds like a lot like the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? And it's kind of almost as if the author is telling us through the preacher that true happiness and meaning is found in the perfect world that God created before sin and the curse. And the message is clear that we cannot recreate that world. We cannot find rest in this age. But we can find rest in the world that God intended to be created, and which He will restore. Remember, He's talking to these Jews, the Jewish people who have come back from the Babylonian captivity, and they're rebuilding the city and rebuilding the temple. For what purpose? Because their king is coming on a donkey. He's going to deliver them from their enemies, and He's going to restore the rest that God promised them. That's what they're longing for, you see. And rest, you see, becomes an important theme in the storyline of redemption. In Genesis 2, we read, on the seventh day God rested from His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all of the work that He had done. And then in Hebrews 4:3, we read, we who believed entered that rest, although His works were finished from the foundation of the world. Verse 9, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And what happened in between those things? The fall, the curse. So God is saying that I promise to restore the creation to what it used to be, to remove the curse, to remove the effects of sin, to deliver us from the penalty of sin, so that we can enter into His rest. So yes, so all of the things that this world has to offer are types and pictures of the joy and happiness and peace that we can have when God has restored everything to the way it should be. So therefore, that joy and that happiness still eludes us in this life, but it is the thing, but it is to be found in the next life. The saying goes, there's no rest for the wicked, but the truth is that there's no rest for anyone in this world. And when somebody dies, what do we say? We say, may he rest in peace. Well, again, unless you enter God's rest, God's eternal Sabbath rest, there is no rest for the dead either. Life was supposed to be restful and meaningful and make us happy. But as long as the curse remains, it never will. This really is his first point. That brings us to his conclusion in verses 24 to 26. The conclusion, verses 24 to 26. Let's read those. Verse 24. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. Some have read verse 24 as kind of in one person's words, a nihilistic, pessimistic negativism. That sounds pretty awful, doesn't it? In other words, let's just resign ourselves to the fact that tomorrow we die, so therefore let's eat, drink, and be merry. Well, that's not what he's talking about. If that was his conclusion, then he actually wouldn't go on. He would end his sermon right there. Doesn't need any of the other points. But he has a positive response. He has more to say. This is just his first point, and he's saying this world is not the place where we find happiness. The pursuit of happiness is the goal, what we need to do, but it's in the world that God is going to restore. That's his conclusions. How do we get to this world that God has restored? That's his next question. And what he is saying here is that there is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. He is saying that there is nothing better than being happy. Everyone wants to be happy. I mean, that's the American dream, isn't it? There's no greater pursuit. God gives the one who pleases him the wisdom and the knowledge and the know-how to become wealthy so that he can enjoy the pleasures and luxuries of life. So the one who pleases God then gives it to his heirs and who've actually never earned it or deserved it, but they can be happy too by receiving it. It's not negativity he's emphasizing here, it's positivity. Okay? But I can pass that happiness on through the life that I've accumulated and built. I can pass it on to my heirs, and it doesn't really matter whether they deserve it or not. Now it does cause them problems that if they're a fool and lose it all, then they got nothing to pass on. Let me see if I can focus in on what he's saying here in this conclusion. I think he's saying this. Life gave him joy, but he realizes that death takes it all away. Only to emphasize that there is really no meaning for joy in this life. That we cannot separate this life from the life that God means for it to be. And that true happiness comes in that life. Now he's saying it's not that we shouldn't pursue happiness here or pursue luxuries and own big cars and big houses, have swimming pools and stuff like that. He's not saying that. Okay, but he says, but he wants us to make sure that we understand that things never satisfy. But we need to learn to be happy with the things that we have because they come to us as a gift from God. Well, what if our work was never intended to make us successful, but to make us happy? We long for meaning in a world of constant repetition, and we dream of how we can actually interrupt the cycles so that we can find meaning. But the only interrupter is death. And for most of us, we don't need to go there. what does death bring us? It brings us into the next life. And it seems that meaning in life can only be found in death. Because death brings us to that new life. But what does the New Testament teach us? It teaches us that the death that gets us to the life of rest is not our death, but the death of Jesus Christ. It is his death on the cross, in dying in our place, in bearing the penalty for our sins, that we are able to be brought into. That's why he said in Hebrews 4, you have already entered the rest by believing. Wow. So we can actually enter the rest of God now in this life. So that meaning in this life is not from this life, but from the life of rest that we have in this life. Did you follow that? Okay. We need to get back to the Garden of Eden and enter day 7. The eternal rest, the Sabbath rest, or the great and final eternal Jubilee. And all of those days started at the cross. And we have them at our to get now, but we don't have them in its fullness. That comes when Jesus returns. One day God will restore life to the way it was meant to be, and he calls us to believe, and he says, enter my rest. Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all who labor, okay, that's the toil of life, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you what? Rest. So have you put your faith in Jesus Christ? Is it his death that brings you life? Believe today. When we accept that we're going to die and we stop expecting too much from all of the good things that we pursue, everything we have right now, we need to realize that it's okay to pursue these luxuries, but not because they make us happy, but because they're actually just gifts from God. So God wants us to be happy, and he wants us to enjoy the luxuries of life. But don't try to find meaning or purpose or the happiness in those. It's only God who is the source of happiness. Everything we have is a gift from God. Whether it's a tiny apartment or a mansion, whether it's a Cadillac or a smart car, whether it is president of the company or you're the janitor, whether it's an iPhone 11 that you have in your pocket or a rotary dial-up landline that you have. It doesn't matter. These things do not produce happiness. But because they are gifts from God, we can be happy in them. So whether you have a degree or not, so whether you're a billionaire or on welfare, whether you eat at the Ritz or from the food bank, happiness is not determined by the quality of what you have, but that you have. And everything you have is a gift from God. It's not the source of happiness or the source of meaning, but it does give us joy when we put it in perspective. So in this world of constant cycles and monotonous routines, God gives us gifts to make us happy and to be joyful. But we have to realize that the meaning comes by only being in the life to come. And we can only get there by going through the death of Jesus Christ. So the question again, what does man gain by toil under the sun? That's what he was answering. He says he gets gifts from God, and those gifts make him happy. And he can benefit from those because they remind him that the world is not the way God intended to be, but we can enter into that world through Jesus Christ. So, what's he going to do with death, though? This is his big quandary right now. That's the next question he's got to answer. Well, what do we do about death? So if you look at chapter 3, verse 1, which will be the beginning of our text next time, it says, for everything there is a season, a time to be born, and a time to die. He's going to answer that question next. May God bless you from his word today. Well, let's